Hey guys, my name is Jeremy Mendy, and I am one of the GD2 faculty, along with Anna Lorente, like you said, and Marie Banas back here. And so I think we've got 3 sections of GD2. I know we have 3 sections of GD2, and then I know John is here with some grad students. Is that right? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are here to welcome and hear from Paul Soulellis.
That's right.
About a number of things, I think. But I wanted to say a couple things. Paul and I met kind of briefly back in Italy back in 2011. We were both doing kind of residency work over there. And it was interesting because I was looking at the name of his talk, if I can get out of the way here, publishing as practice as resistance. And I was thinking back, and when we were both there, we were both working in this idea of design as activism, design as resistance. And I was doing a project which was trying to take advantage of public space and street space and thinking about resistance in a kind of public manner.
Oh, I remember that.
And Paul was working on a book project that was kind of looking at some related ideas but in a more intimate format of a book. And it didn't really dawn on me until I was thinking about this that we were both kind of working in parallel tracks, but just at sort of different, I guess, different foci or different areas of focus. And so, very curious to hear what you've been doing since that time in these ensuing 8 years. So Paul is an artist and educator, and I think writer, from New York City, now more recently teaching at Rhode. And I want to read this one piece, so I want to get it right. His practice includes teaching, writing, experimental publishing with a focus on queer methodologies and network culture. And I know you're out here doing an installation at the Internet Archive, right?
That's right.
Yeah, great. Publish as practice as resistance, Paul Soulellis. Thank you for coming to CCA. Welcome.
Thanks, Thank you so much for that lovely intro. Thank you so much, Mary, for arranging this and for making this happen. Mary's out there. Come on in. Hi, her.
I think they should go on it.
There's space over there. There are couches. Come on in. Haven't even really started. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to give this talk and really talk about what's happened in those 8 years. And so the first half of the talk is really about sort of just what I've been up to and sort of my practice in general. The second half of the talk is pretty new material. I gave this talk a couple of times this fall back on the East Coast. And the ideas in there are really fresh and new, so I would really love feedback. I would consider these ideas in the second half of the talk really being still evolving. So, I worked for quite a while in branding and corporate identity, and this included running my own design studio in New York City for about 15 years plus. And you might be happy to know that I'm not going to talk about any of this work. So more recently meaning in like the last 8 to 9 years, I started creating my own work and started making time to ask questions that had nothing to do with running a business, like what kind of art and design do I believe in, and how do I use graphic design when it's not being performed as a service. And so for a number of years, really starting back then in Rome, I made artist publications where I discovered that the book form could be a container for my own ideas in an intimate way. I mean, Jeremy mentioned the intimacy of working in a book form. That's totally it. And I really enjoyed this. During this time, I really felt my view expanding, but it was also scary because I didn't always know where it was going or where I was going with this. And the more publications I made, the more I took on all aspects of production and distribution. And I found that the book could also be a social object, connecting me to people, connecting people to each other, and even forming communities through the work. So I'm not really getting into any detail about the book projects that I'm showing you here. I did a whole series of site-specific publishing projects that you've been seeing. But through them, I really experienced a profound shift in how I think about graphic design. A few years ago, I really began to see what I do as publishing. Not publishing as in the publishing industry, but publishing as an art practice. Around this time, I heard about a group of artists making print-on-demand books called ABC, Artists Books Cooperative. And they also heard about me, and the next thing I knew, I was a member of this co-op. And this was an entirely new community for me. Members were scattered all around the world, and we would just meet up at art book fairs. And I was just so intrigued because most of the ABC artists were making printed books using material from the internet. So they were engaging with network culture. This is Mishka Henner, who had recently at that time made Dutch Landscapes, this book, which was a series of photographs taken from Google Maps at places where the Dutch government had censored particular locations by pixelating them. And Joachim Schmidt in Germany was the founder of ABC. This is a work called Other People's Photographs, where he accumulated a massive collection of images from Flickr, all taken by strangers to him, and he grouped them together into categories, and he published them as a new vernacular of digital photography. And this kind of, those two and many others, opened up a whole new practice for me, mining the web for material. I looked around and found so many other artists working this way with network material. So I started collecting some of these projects. And in 2013, I got an opportunity to show them all together as a collection. I had this project, Clement Balla's 50 postcards from Google Earth. Clement teaches at Rhizome now. And David Horvitz's portraits of sad, depressed people, which are all taken from stock photo websites. And this funny book by Chris Alexander, which is an archive of thousands of tweets containing the word McNugget. Strange, some of them were strange works. All in all, about 50 artists' works that I wheeled around in this funny wooden box that I had made, and I called it Library of the Printed Web. This is a shot from when I first brought all this material together in 2013. And there was so much interest in this collection. I mean, it's hard to believe this is only 5-6 years ago, but at that moment, this still felt new. Today, less so, I think. So I decided to keep it going, and it grew, and I continued to curate and to collect. All around a very simple idea, network culture articulated as print artifact. My interest was in these artists who were asking questions about materiality and slowing down the web, and concepts like authorship and aura and accessibility. So Library of the Printed Web became a whole new way for me to think about community and books as social objects. I was reaching out to these artists and getting to know them, and they started seeking me out to send me their work. I was getting work on a weekly basis. And I started packing it up and actually carrying this collection around the world and taking it on the road and giving talks about it. And I even published a kind of manifesto called Search, Compile, Publish, which I distributed in an edition of 500 for free at the New York Art Book Fair. And I think that also started to get this project moving. The collection grew to include printed spam, a mug printed with declassified NSA documents, a zine of Richard Prince's stolen Instagrams, very controversial project, and dozens of works that raised crucial questions about copyright, image production, and artistic practice in the 21st century. I was also making work in this vein, and this is one of my projects. So Library of the Printed Web grew to be about 250 works. All of the work I had collected had been produced in the span of just a couple of years. And I would identify that period roughly from around 2007 or 8, 2015, as post-iPhone and pre-Trump. And I think that's significant. I'll come back to that later. It was the time when the internet began to get more personal and also, at the same time, more corporate and more centralized. It was asking for our trust. The internet was traveling with us, revealing itself in more and more surprising places. These are all works that I'm showing you from Library of the Printed Web. It was the beginning of total network saturation. Artists and designers were learning to perform their work in networked space. We began to carry the browser around with us all day and to sleep beside it at night. I mean, we all do this now, but at that moment, it felt new. So what did it mean to now see it on paper? How does screen-based work change when printed? The relationship between web pages and printed pages became less and less fixed, and Library of the Printed Web became my way to perform and celebrate this slippery condition. So for the next 5 years, I used Library of the Printed Web to build my own artist's practice. But I wanted to take the curatorial part of the project even further, and I thought, why not present new work from these artists? Many of them had become friends, and I was doing studio visits with them on a regular basis. First, I considered starting a gallery, but I was inspired by, he had just died at the time, Seth Siegelob, and how he used the form of the publication itself to stage an exhibition. And he did this most famously in 1968 with the Xerox book. Each of these 7 artists got 25 pages for their work, and that was their real estate within the book. And each submission would be photocopied 1,000 times and bound up into this book. So this was a group show in the form of an edition of 1,000 books that would circulate without any need for a physical gallery space. So the publication was the show. I was really inspired by that idea, so I decided to do the same thing. For Printed Web, number 1, I designed it so that each artist got 3 spreads, 6 pages, to stage their web-to-print work. And this first issue contained work from these 10 artists, a kind of, I thought, appropriation dream team, and a text by Hiroshi Earl. I was really excited. I printed an edition of 1,000 of these, and it launched at the LA Art Book Fair in January 2014. Here's the second issue, which featured James Bridle, right here, and number 3, which was an open call with submissions from 150 artists. And here's number 4, which was co-published with curator Charlotte Cotton at ICP in New York, International Center of Photography. And number 5, which was an anthology of bots that launched 2 years ago. So each of these was an experiment in print on demand. So I changed the format each time, newsprint, books. And I also did some great one-on-one collaborations as well with artists like Molly Soda and her YouTube channel, and Raphael Rosendahl, who published his abstract browsing Chrome extension as a 72-page zine. He also makes tapestries of these now, which are incredible. So last year, the entire project, including all of the works I had collected and everything I had published, was acquired by MoMA Library in New York. And before delivering the collection to them, I made this catalog of the whole thing, kind of like a record of the whole project. It's got every artifact in it, all of the details, and it includes some really good texts that were written especially for the book, including by David Senior, who's now here at SF MoMA. He was at MoMA New York at the time. And MoMA did this incredible thing. I still can't believe it. They gave the whole collection its own call number designation, LPW, so that all 250 works can stay together on the shelves at MoMA Library and be easily researched as a single project. So that makes me kind of ecstatic, I have to say, knowing that I can just send people to MoMA now to study the collection, and that it's being properly preserved and cared for by real librarians. This small project that I started now works to fill in a small corner in the history of artistic publishing, and now I can do that work well beyond my lifetime without me being involved. But now that I've got some distance, I'm starting to see the project differently. It's been absorbed into this ultimate archive, placed into a deeper timeline. Today, artists and designers work in and around the internet by default. It's connected to everything that we do. The printed web is no longer a new condition. It's not even an unusual one. Now that it's at MoMA, this struck me really hard last year. It's pointing back in time, not forward. When I started the project, it really felt about the future. Now it feels like it's the past. Back to a very particular way of working at the start of the 21st century. So I once tried to identify each of the artists in Library of the Printed Web by defining these web-to-print techniques. Grabbing images and text, hunting for anomalies, scraping websites for data, and performing digital material into new contexts. So these ideas are nothing new. These are basic appropriation tactics that have been in use for over 100 years. But if we want to understand how artists work in cut and paste culture today, I think we need to go further. We need to look deeper into our archives at the power dynamics that flow in and out of these platforms. Who profits when work is taken? What are the politics of appropriation? So, right after Trump got elected, it hit me like a brick. How could I possibly use words like grabbing and hunting? Yeah, I was crying, not laughing, to talk about my work. I was kind of stunned at the moment. I couldn't talk this way about my work. How come in all of this time I hadn't seen these concepts? And many of the works in Library of the Printed Web that were explicitly about taking work made by others, how did I not see these as problematic gestures? How come it had taken me so long to see grabbing as an imperialist concept, as an aggressive expression of colonization and violence? So I was embarrassed and I panicked because this felt like a crisis. Suddenly, post-Trump, I didn't know how to talk about my own work. So this wasn't just about language and those words. I was certain in that moment that my own publishing practice as an artist and as a designer needed to engage more explicitly with politics and power. So, just after Trump's inauguration, I quickly made a new zine. I had noticed that a lot of information had disappeared from the White House website. So I used the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive here in San Francisco to look more closely, and I discovered that whole sections had disappeared from whitehouse.gov at 5 p.m. on January 20th, 2017, Inauguration Day. Pretty much any content related to African Americans, Asian Americans, LGBTQ, women, seniors, children, veterans, people with disabilities, all gone from whitehouse.gov. Instead, the Trump White House had replaced each page with this message: thank you for your interest in this subject. That's it. So this work that I made documents an act of removal that for the most part had already been forgotten, and certainly has been now. Since then, his administration has totally redesigned whitehouse.gov, and all this stuff is, of course, still gone. So on all the left-hand pages, the original Obama content. On every right-hand page, that same URL at that time showing Trump's message. How do we choose what to preserve? As artists and designers, we make these decisions every day. Any tweet, any image, any website could be considered a valuable artifact or garbage in our post-truth condition. There's an immense pressure to save and to accumulate everything, but also to select and amplify particular messages. After the Trump election, I saw people printing tweets and carrying them high above their heads at protests. This had a huge impact on me. It's when I started to see the printed web as so much more than just a curatorial art project. Bernie Sanders brought a large printed tweet to the Senate floor during a debate on healthcare. This act of drawing from digital archives and materializing it, the information, isolating it either in an artist's book or in the newspaper or on a protest sign, serves as an interruption. It's a kind of reminder in public that at this particular moment, something was said. So as rhetoric continues to explode everywhere, online and off, broadcast and consumed and circulated without restraint, materiality still seems to be one way to resist, or at least slow down the narrative in moments like these. Thank you for your interest in this subject. Felt like a small step forward for me, tiny step. It showed me how I might move my practice in a new direction, how I might use appropriation as a way to interrupt power, to document what's happening around us, to take a second look as a form of resistance. But I'm still struggling with how to make sense as an artist, as a designer in the face of crisis, with an overwhelming feeling that as conditions become more and more urgent, my own practice must continue to respond. I feel it shifting daily. I'm increasingly disappointed by so-called political art and a rhetoric that relies on humor and humiliation and spectacle. Parody and satire feel insufficient right now, even negligent to me. I don't want to contribute to the entertainment factor and the instinct to fuel the addictive, sickening cycle of news surrounding this current administration. Instead, I'm now looking more and more towards critical writing, not visual art, for clues about how to deal with crisis, particularly around failure and futurity. How do we look forward when our vision is blurred in a vertigo-like spell of confusion? How do we find new ways to construct culture, to imagine new societies, when the tools that we might use are restricted and bound up in systems of oppression? Caught up in ideologies that are historically defined by racism, misogyny, and the production of capital. So I've been looking for help from writers and theorists. For me, this struggle is soothed somewhat by teaching, where I get a chance to engage in direct conversation with students and colleagues about how to sharpen our view, how to establish a critical practice that's built on equity, inclusivity, and openness. This in itself feels like resistance. It doesn't work perfectly, but it seems like good work. And sometimes I'm surprised at how radical the results can be. Still, I'm yearning for more. Recently, the graphic design department at RISD, where I teach, held its triennial exhibition. This is last semester. It's a major showcase for us, a snapshot of our department. And our students produced a remarkable publication for the event, which includes writing by several students. I knew that the publication had come together during the space of a week. And this by itself was of interest to me, that an urgent act of publishing was possible, at least in speed, and that these students knew how to get it done. The only undergraduate whose writing was included was Tiger Dingsum, and his short text, printed on newsprint, stopped me in my tracks. It's titled The Unbearable Whiteness of Being a Graphic Designer. It's powerful because it's an unresolved provocation. It's a protest piece embedded within the show itself. My read, and he and I talked about it, is that it expresses a struggle from the position of an Asian American queer student at an art and design school to find their own voice as a graphic designer in relation to personal identity and societal oppression. It's an open expression of frustration, a self-reflection that's trying to work something out. The text describes a negotiation between a student and his work and the white environment that both enables and resists it. The piece is a critique submitted to an exhibition that had the stated theme of inclusiveness. In response to the show, the text seems to say inclusivity isn't enough. When will we talk about whiteness and the white culture we operate in? It includes an expression of hope that white people will take on more of the work of critiquing white hegemony. Tiger says he sees the spark of self-recognition in their eyes. It slowly renders a fire. So that makes me think of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's concept of the undercommons here. Specifically this thought that the undercommons is a place for subversive intellectuals to send out signals to see each other and imagine new ways of seeing the future. And that in the undercommons, the only relationship we can have to the university is to steal from it. To be in it without being of it. And to actively use the institution's resources without giving in to its values, which are inevitably going to be tied up in complex histories of bias and profit. I encourage you to read their book or the one essay that really describes this concept if you're interested in that. It's a position I'm trying to sketch out myself, and I'm on the lookout for that recognition. Both the self-recognition that slowly renders a fire in the eyes, as well as seeing and acknowledging those students who aren't satisfied with the conventions of a good art and design education. On the lookout for others, peers, for students, others out there in our queer orbits, trying to find our way through muddy waters. I frequently confess to students that I'm not there to teach them anything, that we can learn from each other. And I mean it. I mention this particular critical text, the undercommons, because it's a sharp moment, and Tiger's, where I can admit to being energized. Because a student coming out of our program, although it could be this program, anyone really, is doing this kind of digging in a way that pierces the niceties of graphic design. So I'm hopeful, as Tiger says he is, but also I'm challenged by him, maybe directly so, to look back into my own eyes and the eyes of my colleagues, as he suggests, to self-recognize within the institution my own position and role as a white faculty member at a private art and design school in New England. And I think this is really the best that an urgent act of publishing can do, to show up, to make an appearance in public, provoke, question established positions, and energize others. Not simply an appearance of good design, but discourse that digs, that stays in the eyes long enough to start a fire. Discourse that asks us to read differently. Here in this particular context, I ask myself directly, is my own work doing anything? Is it urgent enough? Is it grounded in or foregrounded by crisis? Does it resist oppression in any way? Does it provide a platform for others who speak or write or create from historically marginalized positions to express their points of view? So these are questions that I'm asking myself and the communities with which I engage, demands that may allow for new kinds of work to happen. I have a new project I want to share with you. It's a publication called QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK. But first, I want to sketch out these demands as a way of framing this new work. And for me, these are becoming more and more central, these demands, to any discussion of urgent publishing, queering design, and what publishing as practice, as resistance might mean. So this is an idea that I'm taking from Jack Halberstam, one of the contributors to the first issue of QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK. and he's also the author of The Queer Art of Failure. In an event that I organized at MoMA PS1 this past fall at the New York Art Book Fair, Jack declared it in this way: become illegible. He spoke about this in relation to gender fluidity, ways of being outside of the gender binary and cis-normativity, structures that are so firmly established in language and culture. And I've been thinking about how our surveillance state wants more and more to read our bodies clearly, reading us as agents of capital, as consumers, as laborers, as profit producers, reading our faces and our bodies as clearly seen targets. To remove clarity from reading is an intriguing strategy, I think. It's different from camouflage. It's not necessarily about visibility, or hiding, or becoming invisible. The demand asks that we resist being read clearly as a political position. And this is a demand that's difficult for me to make as a professor of graphic design. Is this something I could ever possibly teach? Isn't this in direct conflict with the canon and the legacy of good design and communications? What if we take this all the way and talk about illegibility as a design strategy? I'm not sure it's a valid idea, but I want to test it. By the way, we're in the part of the talk where these are the evolving ideas part. What would it mean to design a text using this strategy? At a moment when truth is more and more difficult to recognize, is there room for illegibility? I think so. I imagine what it would be like to publish a text that can't be searched by Google, or stored by Dropbox, or hosted by GoDaddy, or a collection of texts that can't be read in any one order, or from any one perspective. The idea of bad typography, or no dominant read, or reading that isn't fixed, a variety of reads that are all equally valid. In a conversation recently with one of my students, Nick Conrad, he called it, this whole idea, messy legibility, messy sense-making. So maybe resisting legibility means encouraging or creating new kinds of reading. Close reading, imperfect, difficult reading, messy reading. And that brings me to my second demand. What kind of design strategies would we explore or teach to allow for the resistance of legibility? If we begin with legibility itself, designing for the perfect read means good typography that conveys a preferred reading. I think of hierarchy and the most basic notions of language that come from signaling importance of one notion over another through a series of design decisions. I mean, that's what we're all learning, hopefully, in type. When we use hierarchy, one thing over another, we create the conditions for bias. A reading experience that doesn't affirm hierarchy and notions of the subordinate, meaning that no author or artist exists in a secondary position, this is actually quite unusual. It's difficult to find examples. What would it look like to maybe not do away with hierarchy, but to explore it intentionally? To subvert it, to create a space, the space of a publication or a page or within a browser, where hierarchical demands aren't as expected, where the reader or the viewer is given the agency to wander, to float, to make different kinds of decisions about where to look first. To arrive at a kind of understanding that isn't based on rank and authority. I also think of the craft in typography and the emphasis we place on making language look good for optimal legibility. I enjoy kerning, like anyone else. Hope you all do too. But if we kern, if we're spacing the letters towards perfection, I mean, that is what we teach. We're striving for some ideal version of how language is supposed to present itself. to correct the software and adjust for able viewing without gaps or odd letter combinations that take away from a clear, linear notion of understanding. I'd like to resist kerning. Is it possible that the unkerned word is a queer word? A word that refuses to conform to Western standards of correctness and good typography? Sal Randolph, in the first issue of QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK, writes that plain text is queer text, ungarnished language that resists normative conventions and legacy systems. This makes so much sense to me. Plain text, unkerned, text that works on its reader without the assertion of importance and hierarchy, and all of the legacy design values that come along with so-called correct design. I'm talking about how we train ourselves to fall into place with normal design conventions, decisions based on conformity, assumptions about what constitutes good, consistent reading. I'm also particularly interested in how binding works to maintain legacy systems of hierarchy and the fixed read. To bind materials is to fix them, to physically tie parts together so that they can't separate and become undone. To resist binding might mean to let different texts and authors and perspectives intermingle, for order and authority to shift as the direction of reading changes. It may even mean that individual pages or sheets can loosen and come undone. And I mean this literally, to resist a preferred read. And we can find several examples of this throughout history where the reader is given more agency to re-author the text. But how might we take this out of the realm of the alternative or the precious and explore the loose assemblage as a political move, as well as an artistic one, to loosen hegemonic order? I'm also reminded that this is what we revere today as the pinnacle of design perfection. And I'm showing this here in San Francisco and the Bay Area where this ideology is created. It's also this is where we do a lot of our reading. The richest company in the world has asserted its design ideology into everyone's pockets, giving us new standards for craft that seem otherworldly, even non-human. I don't think it's any accident that the DIY culture of art book fairs and artistic self-publishing has exploded in the last 10 years, following the mass introduction of an aesthetic like this one in 2007. Gotha came into power during this time, and entirely new design industries like user interface and user experience design have been valorized and absorbed into art and design schools to feed the enormous workforce that's needed to maintain a design ideology based on perfection at all costs. I'd like to argue that there's another kind of craft to be found in urgency, different from what we think of as the work of the artist's hand at one extreme, and tech utopia's marketing of craft as an almost non-human magic at the other. What does urgent craft feel like? Perhaps it's somewhere in the artist's ability to produce independently under crisis conditions, without corporate or institutional support. In the agility and flexibility needed to deliver messages that reflect an author's immediate context, like Tiger's text, written in just a couple of days. It might mean shifting design skills from easy web-based services like print-on-demand printing, which I used for years, to more artist-controlled skills like risograph and silk screening, both of these being easy, cheap, high-quality, ink on substrate methods for reproducing text and image. And to acknowledge that queer environments might require new kinds of reading. Maybe it's about reprioritizing design decisions to focus on who is being included in art and design conversations, and how to more openly access their work rather than what it looks like. The sociality of design, artist-controlled, collaborative, and peer-to-peer initiatives that bring artists and writers into direct contact with each other, a network of relations that focus on ideas, discourse and the present moment. Finally, I believe that we need more radical publishing. And of course, there's a long history of this, of radical content being published as a means towards change, like abolitionist pamphlets, by activists in the first half of the 19th century, Emory Douglas's Black Panther newspaper in the late 1960s. And there's been publishing that's radical in distribution, like the handwritten and hand-typed books that circulated in the former Soviet Union, passed along in total secrecy, peer-to-peer. Networks that could never be fully identified. Internet culture felt radical for a while. My project Library of the Printed Web was a way to catalog that fascination, but appropriation and the circulation of images has become so mainstream that the manipulation of messages as they travel through the network is now our default condition. Maybe the most stunning use of the internet right now isn't avant-garde or artistic at all, but the radicalized position of our leaders, along with other authoritarian right-wing voices, using popular social media platforms, the same ones we use, to shape mass opinion. On the other hand, I see whistleblowers performing truly radical acts of publishing that weren't possible before the internet, at least not in the same way, confusing the private-public binary in all senses with leaks that expose information to new audiences and change our understanding of power. These are urgent acts that shift the balance by pulling the binary apart. The leak as a queer act, I think, allowing information to flow in new, unexpected directions. The surprise conversion from private to public. The leak allows for a different kind of reading, a close read that's only possible by making a mess, a chaotic rearranging of status and power simply by shifting positions. I don't think all leaks are good, by the way. I think we need to be careful when looking at them, but they're important that they're happening. I tried to explore this in Steve, Harvey, and Matt, a project I did this past year that takes the form of a live stream, a book, and a download. It's focused on the weekend in April 2017 when the EPA deleted 2,000 web pages having to do with climate change from their website, epa.gov. This is where I started to think about queering the artist's publication, to decenter myself as an artist and put the emphasis on messy action. I tried to reactivate this archive of lost web pages in a futile and illegible way. It's an archive in pieces, and it doesn't really work as an archive at all, but it tells a compelling story of failure. By the way, if you're interested in that, I did a whole 1-hour talk on it at the Walker last March. It's online. QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK sets another stage for these demands. It's a place to gather and to experiment and ask, what does queer publishing feel like right now? Gay, lesbian, transgender, people of color, and other historically marginalized positions have frequently been left out of archives, rendered invisible in cultural discourse because of homophobia and neglect and racism. So my aim is to work with artists and writers to bring queer perspectives into view, not as an alternative, but as fact. To make this work visible in the present and let it mingle, and to enable and construct new relationships between artists. For the first issue, I invited these 14 contributors because I felt that each was working with some kind of queer methodology, trying to subvert normal narratives by writing or imaging in a different way. Several of the works call out non-linearity, like these images by Unity Press here in Oakland. I hope some of you know these two, Jeff and Gabe. If you don't, go out there and visit. This one by Som Thot, former student of mine. They didn't know about each other. They both used this idea of non-linearity. I was really shocked. What's striking to me is that several of the contributions evoke destruction. like Jack Halberstam's Demolition Man, using Grace Jones and Gordon Matta Clark to ask us not to work for the improvement of existing systems, but rather to tear it all down, to dismantle the master's house. And Nora Khan's essay, The Possibility of a Field, which is about misreading, seeing inward, and creating new icons to reverse normative values. She conjures up the artist Ramelzy and his destruction of a cityscape to make her point. By the way, Mary brought her copy of QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK here, so we can lay it out and take a look at these items after. I didn't even bring one with me, sorry. But these are good images. Nate Piper just graduated from Yale's GD program, MFA. He contributed this self-immolation, visualized as a burning body wrapped around a house. And there's an incredible poem on the other side. And also Bay Area artist Porpentine Charity Hardscapes, surreal and violent gamescape. She is a trans video game designer. So messy legibility is everywhere in this issue, especially in Nicole Killian's full-page broadsheet, which is set in all caps in the fonts Brush Script and Walter. Nicole's text can be read, but it's not easy. She did a reading from this, I couldn't believe it, at Rhizome recently. The typography asks us to work harder, to focus, to commit to a different kind of reading here. It may also be saying that it's not for everyone to read. This is weird, bad typography. And Nicole will be the first to admit it, and she uses it to set her iPhone poetry. She's mixing capitalist forms, there's Disney in there, with Twitter literature that's crafted but not refined. It's queer and non-conforming. It looks like a mess, and it uses that look to say something like, I dare you. So, here's the second issue. This is what I've been doing here in San Francisco for the last 3 weeks during my residency at the Internet Archive. I didn't know when I arrived, by the way, that I would be doing the second issue of QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK, but it kind of happened really quickly, and it's been amazing. Both of these issues are unlike anything I've done before. They're designed to make a mess, both in the bag as the components shift around and when they slide out of their container. There's no preferred narrative, just a collection of items that can be read in any order. Nothing in this publication is bound. No staples, glue, or tape. The parts use folding, nesting, and enveloping to bring the ideas together loosely in a messy, legible way. Sheets can be pulled out and rearranged, reordered, maybe even rewritten. I think there's a power in this loose assembling, gathering artists together into an urgent moment and letting that moment be defined by the artists themselves, letting the ideas seep out, mingle and entangle in a mess of relations that's probably meant to remain unresolved. If you want to learn more about the project, the name of the project is also the URL. As it continues, I want to test my 3 demands more intentionally. I want to grow this network of artists into a chain of relationships, letting us publish quickly and urgently, putting the work out there together to speculate and imagine together. Somehow this feels like the most radical part. To collaborate and build something strong that resists a quick and easy read, something multifaceted that shines and reflects all at once, occupying several positions at once, as if to say, let's look together at the potential of this present moment, let's gather a loose assemblage to enable a becoming. And that's it. If you want to read this talk is posted at my site. You can go there and see it all. That's it. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple of questions? 10 minutes?
Okay.
Comments, feedback, tear it all down.
Slides. Yeah. Also, if you, are there still tickets for tomorrow's thing?
Oh, yeah,
Can
let
you
me just
talk
say,
about that? Yeah,
so-
just in case people are free.
This happened so quickly, the second issue of QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK, that I haven't even had a chance to really like create a talk around it specifically. But tomorrow, the Internet Archive, if you have never been there, it's an amazing place to check out. It's right here in the city. It's in an old church, and there are 4 petabytes of servers in there that are recording and archiving the internet at all times for the last 22 years. So, I mean, it's an amazing institution. They invited me to come and help them celebrate the public domain, which for 20 years has been static. Nothing new has gone into the public domain. And that's because Walt Disney in 1998 decided they were scared that Mickey Mouse was coming into the public domain from 1924, I think, or 25. So they put a halt on it, the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act. Kind of amazingly, Disney stopped the public domain for 20 years. So anyway, that 20 years was up on January 1st, 2019, and everything from 1923 has entered the public domain. So tomorrow is this huge celebration of that at the Internet Archive. They asked me to come in and do something with that, and I said, well, let me take a look at everything from 1923 that you've been uploading. What's there? And you know, not surprisingly, I found, for instance, that in 3,000 images that they had uploaded, all tagged in 1923, there wasn't a single image of a person of color. And I mean, I know that that wasn't intentional on their part, but still, it's remarkable that this was this perfect portrait of whiteness as a reflection of society, sitting right there about to be celebrated. So I started adding things to the archive. And so this publication, which I'm launching tomorrow, I'm giving away 100 copies of it in a reading room at the Internet Archive starting at 10 a.m. It contains African American, Native American, very early LGBTQ voices. I mean, that language was very different in the 20s, so you know it was difficult to find. But remarkably, I found the very first openly lesbian book of poetry ever was published in 1923. It's now in the public domain. It's a very rare book. It had never been digitized, and I found a copy of it here in San Francisco and got the estate of the author to send me a PDF, and it's now on archive.org. So this issue is filled with all of that stuff. So come on by tomorrow if you can.
What time is it?
It starts at 10. From 10 to 1, it's open, and it's besides me, there's Wikipedia, EFF, Creative Commons, Larry Lessig and Cory Doctorow are giving keynote talks. I'm giving an 8-minute talk specifically on this project. So from 8 to 1 it's open. You can come in and find me in the reading room. At 1 p.m. until 6, there's talks in the big church space. And yeah, and then there's a big celebration tomorrow night at Yerba Buena Center of the Arts. DJ Spooky is doing a whole celebration of the internet with the Internet Archive. Who knows what that's going to be like, but I'll be there too. It's a big day. And then I fly back Saturday. Any questions or comments? If not, you can reach out to me, find me if you want to send me a note.
We don't even have one comment.
John?
Yeah, can you just talk, I'm just curious of what you've been doing from sort of day-to-day on your stay here and like your residency and like what that has been like, what kind of research you've been. I'm just curious because I might not be able to ask you.
Yeah.
Later.
Sure.
How it's feeding your projects.
Yeah, so this, maybe I'll take you to the website. There's my email. Oh, no internet, of course. Oh, sorry. Maybe this will work. Let's see. CCA. Anyway, so on a day-to-day basis, I got there and immediately just started looking through their archives. They gave me a desk in the middle of their workspace. They have 150 people working for them, keeping the internet documented. I was, stunned by all of it. I had never been to the Internet Archive before. Oh, you're just looking at a grid, sorry. So I started looking at what had been uploaded, as I talked about. And I spent the first couple of days really just doing heavy searching, collecting, finding. I was tagging things. And when I started to see that many things weren't there, I started looking elsewhere. So I spent a couple of days searching through the public domain collections at New York Public Library, Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, Digital Public Library of America, and found some amazing stuff. I mean, the things that are in this issue. Then at some point in the first week, I thought, you know what, this isn't just a study, this is the second issue of QUEER.ARCHIVE.WORK. I'm just gonna go for it and do it. So this part here is a newsprint kind of catalog that opens up and shows everything that's in the issue. And everything else that you see there are risograph prints with my own annotations on them, handwritten, that I printed myself at Tiny Splendor in Berkeley. I don't know if you all know them. It's run by this guy, Max. It's an amazing space with 3 risograph machines. For $60, you're a member and you can just go there and use their machine. So, you have machines here, don't you? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so no problem. But whatever, it's good for you to know about. For faculty to know, to go out there and just, he has 12 colors. So I showed up there and I thought, okay, I'm just gonna start printing this stuff. And I had one day last week where I was there for 10 hours, just printing stuff out, writing on stuff, layering images, and having a lot of fun. And I made this series of 7 or 8 prints. They're inside the newsprint thing that Newspaper Club printed, and I'm packaging it all up later today and setting it all up in this reading room that I'm making. So really that's what this visit has been like. I've also been just catching up with friends, and it's been a work trip. It's been 3 weeks of solid work.
Hey, Paul, I got one question for you. It's fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Very revealing. And I was thinking as you were talking that I see a lot of alignment with Dada, with 1968 May, with postmodernism, and I'm curious: do you identify with any of those things, or do you see some strong differences, or how would you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about those alignments. May 68, sure. When I mentioned, when one of the demands is publish radically, more radical publishing, I'm definitely thinking of other moments in history where it felt like there was a crisis, there were crisis conditions, and people are reacting and producing and making. I'm also really, probably more than any of those, I'm more influenced by the Occupy movement and how quickly in New York, I was around for that and going down to the park, and there was the People's Library that was set up there, and it was thousands of books that just suddenly appeared in the park for people to use and distribute and circulate. So moments when it feels like there's urgency in what's being done, which I feel goes against a lot of what I have learned about what is good art and design, which is it's careful, it's studied, it takes a lot of time, it's precious. You don't act so quickly. You really, you need to the genius needs to be in their studio and isolate themselves and produce. And I'm wondering what happens if we break that open and start thinking about other ways of producing. So Dada and postmodernism, yeah, they're there in in the background for me, but
Just a number of your tenants, or the tenants you mentioned at the end, it seems like having been to graduate school in the 90s, you know what I mean? The idea of sort of like disrupting the niceties of graphic design and sort of throwing hierarchy out the window and unbinding design so they can be reassembled and the reader becomes the author. These seem like fundamental ideas to postmodernism, and so I'm just curious if you think like, yeah, no, I'm running with that. Or it's like, well, here's where it's different.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious what you all think. Does it feel that different or not? To me, it feels very different because I feel like postmodernism ended up becoming another aesthetic to me. I'm not sure that those. I don't think of it as an ideology. You know, it may have come from that place, and it may have started with. With ideas that felt larger than a style or a sort of way of making. But I feel looking back in history, and maybe, 20 years from now, we're going to look back and think about these Trump years as a style. I don't know, I don't know like how culture will sort of look back and reshuffle and remake sort of history. But I don't know. Does anyone else see major differences?
I mean, I can say something about that.
Yeah.
When I was reading the tenets and the provocations, they came to me more as examples of lived experiences. So when you're talking about illegibility, that is something that as a queer person you experience every day depending on how you express yourself.
Yeah.
So what you're trying to do is convey through this printed media an experience that someone has in their daily life.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel like there could be an even deeper layer to the work in the sense that, let's say that you are illegible in the real world and you face some sort of repercussions because of that illegibility. Those repercussions leave fragments in the identity of the person that's experiencing them. And that always brings me back to this Japanese art called kintsugi, which is basically like reassembling fragmented pieces, but binding them with gold. So you bring a focus to the fragment and the broken. So I was thinking when you were presenting how the printed work can speak not just to the unbinding or the acts of defiance, but also to the repercussions of what is taking place after the fact. So I guess in that sense it breaks away from past styles like postmodernism, because you're representing through media of lived experience.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
How do you, because there is this whole thing about the binding and the printing matters, right? Have you thought how to jump that to like a space like the iPhone or like the media that is like...
set you free class.
Oh,
It's totally fine. I want to continue. And I'll get Rachel's here and get Rachel. But I also want to set free the students, at least some of mine have class. And I don't know if they're...
I can stay. If anyone has to go to class,
Let's keep going.
can we stay and continue that question?
Yeah.
Just before you, for those of you who do have to go, Paul, thank you very much.